Excellent. So, hi. Closed captioning is delightful. All right. So I wanted to kind of start with where I began my journey. And I started at this charity when I first got out of grad school. Um, I was an in-house journalist for this charity, and I wrote day in and day out about cancer research. Um, I can't tell you about a single study I reported on. I can't really remember any of the stats. Um, I mean, I know the science was cool. I know there was a ton of like groundbreaking research and stuff, but to recall a specific one of those, couldn't do it. What I can do and what I can remember is Larry. So Larry got diagnosed with esophageal cancer when he was 50, and he went through treatment and he thought everything was good. And then it came back, it had metastasized into his liver. And I interviewed Larry for a story, and he told me about kind of the heartbreaking news of being diagnosed as terminal. But what really stuck with me is that he regretted doing as much treatment as he did. And I was like, why did you regret doing like as much chemotherapy and radiation? He's like, well, now I have this pins and needle sensation in my hands and mostly in my feet. And there are days where it's so painful I can't walk. My quality of life now is garbage. And that stuck with me. This pins and needles sensation is called neuropathy. And he told me about it, and I remember neuropathy like all the time. And so 5 years later, when I'm walking my dad to his chemo treatment, and he's telling me that his neuropathy, the pins and needle sensation in his hands and feet, which used to go away kind of 3 days after he got a dose, now isn't going away anymore. And he tells me that he's thinking about maybe not doing treatment anymore. He's going to stop his treatment. And at first I'm like super shocked because one, my dad doesn't quit things. And two, you don't quit cancer treatment in the middle of a pandemic when you don't have your surgery scheduled. But after I dropped my dad off and I'm walking back home, I remember Larry, and I remember that he wishes he didn't do as much treatment as he did. And so now that my dad's fully recovered, he doesn't really have those pins and needle sensations anymore, and it gets better every day and starting to go away. And Larry made me feel better about my dad's choice to stop chemo early. But Larry also made neuropathy stick deep inside my brain forever. And that's kind of the power of storytelling. So stories create this understanding and engagement and connection that these facts just can't do. And so when we think about science storytelling and we think about how we communicate this really important research, I always think about the stories behind it and how I can interweave a story within it. And that's not to say that you can't have science in your stories. You can have a lot of science in your stories. I want to play you guys this clip by David Carmel. And he's looking after his dad after he had a stroke. And I want you guys to listen to hear how much science David gets in this short clip.
We think he's strong enough to take a shower on his own. So I help him prepare, and I start the water running, and I go to the living room. And after about a minute, I hear him calling my name. So I rush in, and I find him standing there in his bathrobe. The water's running, and he says to me, "I can't take a shower. The bottom 2/3 of my body are gone." That's my dad, the computer programmer. Not half, not a bit, 2/3, because having a stroke is no reason to be numerically imprecise. I look at him, and I look at his 2 legs sticking out the bottom of his bathrobe, and he sees me looking, and he says, "Well, not gone exactly, just different." And then he proceeds to tell me how the arrangement of his limbs has somehow been altered. And he starts with his right leg, which he says starts normally at the foot and then goes up to his knee. And then when it goes further up, instead of connecting to his pelvis, it continues to go up and past his shoulder and around to where it connects with his chest, which then in turn connects to his arms, which then connect to his left leg. And everything past the shoulder is happening above his head, which is okay, but makes it kind of hard to take a shower. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, holy shit. And then I can't help thinking, cool. You see, there is a representation of the body in the brain. It's called the homunculus. There are actually several homunculi. There's one for the sense of touch. There's one for motion. There's one for proprioception, the sense of where your limbs are at any given time so that you can balance properly. And the homunculus is plastic, meaning it can change over time through experience. For example, the representation of the fingers is larger in pianists. But I've never heard of a complete remapping, a complete rearrangement of the body representation following a stroke. And this would make a fascinating case study. And I start thinking of all the various tests one could do to verify and to quantify the extent of this remapping. And I start also thinking about how we could maybe correlate the symptoms with the lesions that one can see in my dad's MRI. And I can't help rushing forward and thinking about the eventual scientific publication and how cool it would be to make my dad, who never finished high school, a co-author. And just then, my dad says, very matter-of-factly, well, I'm peeing. And I look, and sure enough, there's a large wet stain forming on the front of his bathrobe. And as we both look helplessly, I feel embarrassed for him and ashamed of my own train of thought. Later that night, I decide to do.
So in that little moment of David with his dad in the bathroom trying to figure out how to get his dad to shower, we learn so much about the human brain and how it maps things. I mean, like, now all of you know what a homunculus is. Maybe some of you already knew what it was before, but I didn't when I first heard this story. And now forever, I know exactly what a homunculus is and what it does and how many different kinds there are. That's so cool. And so when it comes to storytelling and getting people engaged in science, it's important to integrate the science into your story, not the story into your science. And I don't just say this because I work for a storytelling podcast. I mean, I say it partially because I work for a storytelling podcast, but also because there's a ton of actual research that backs these ideas up. So when people get transported into a narrative, that the thing that happens when we're watching a movie or a TV show, or we're listening to a podcast or a story, and we're in that moment with the storyteller and we can visualize what's going on, when that narrative transportation happens, ideas become more persuasive, things become more easily understandable, and things become more engaging. In fact, there's one study that shows that when people are transported into a narrative, their eye blinks start to sync up, which honestly is kind of really cool and kind of super creepy. But also, when you can show the kind of thought process behind why maybe someone changed their attitude about something, or why someone did something differently or didn't do something, it helps other people change their attitudes. And there's this study here, the conversion message and attitude change. And it shows that when you show rather than just tell people facts, it creates stronger arguments and is more persuasive. But stories aren't just important for, making your point and getting facts across. Stories are so important for representation. And I don't know if any of you know this study, but they got kids to draw scientists before they'd ever met any. And surprise, surprise, kids draw a lot of Albert Einstein looking gentlemen, very white, have a huge propensity for balding, and like to wear glasses and have coats with a lot of buttons. But what happens when people get to see and hear different types of scientists. And so in this study, they took the kids to the Fermi lab and had them interact with scientists and stuff. And what happens is that their perception of who scientists are changes. And it's not just for kids. I mean, it's really important for adults too. So I wrote this story back in 2018 about how closeted STEM is. And in fact, a large majority of people aren't out in their field. And I did a whole Story Collider show to help kind of shed light on just how diverse scientists can be, because when we don't know who's out there and we can't see ourselves in science, it creates problems. And I want to play this clip by Dan Simpson, who is one of the storytellers at the Story Collider show, and he was later on the podcast, to just show how damaging it can be if you don't see a place for yourself in science.
And I've never been to a conference before. I knew nothing. I knew no one. I was a deeply closeted 20-year-old Catholic self-loathing guy. And it was great fun. Met a bunch of people. It was wonderful. Next morning, I went to lunch, stumbled out of a session, totally not a hangover, 100% on top of this, because I didn't really drink then, because I was a deeply closeted gay guy. And you don't drink when you're deeply closeted, because shit leaks out. And leakage is the enemy of the closet. And so I went and I sat down and I said hi to the people I've been talking to all night. And there were people I didn't know there as well. And this girl said, "Oh, hi everyone, this is Dan. Dan's from QUT and he's gay." And I fucking died. I died. It was the worst case scenario because it was everything I didn't want to happen. And I did what you do. Except not that, because that gives it away. I was cool with it. I made my face look like I hadn't heard what they were talking about the night before. I made my face look like I couldn't see them when she told them and their feelings. And I sat through that lunch and I smiled and I laughed and I talked about maths. And then I got the fuck out of there and did my best to never see them again.
So Dan's story shows us that oftentimes when we feel most isolated, what we got to witness in the room when he told that story is other people had felt that same way. And there's this awesome connection that happens. I remember one of the first times I heard a story about mental health. It was from this girl who had been spiraling in a deep depression and got really obsessed with Oprah magazines and decided one day that she was going to take the advice of the Oprah magazine to do one thing that scared her. And so she decided to go to a pole dancing class. And the entire story, she talks about having to put on her nice sweatpants to go out to this class and stuff. And I have never related to someone so deeply on that level. And it's this connection that we get to see ourselves in other people and know that we're not alone, that can really help capture those moments and help us see other people through a different light. And what happens when we hear stories about scientists is that there's actually this study that was done where they got this intro to bio class in a college to listen to various scientists do TED Talks, or they listen to a Story Collider podcast episode. And what happened over the course of this thing is that their stereotypes of scientists were reduced, and they also got better grades in science, and they just liked science more, which is awesome. And that's kind of what we want to do when we're talking about science communication, is we want people to be engaged in it. And so by showing not just the science, but the humanity behind the science is what really gets people drawn in. And so when we talk about storytelling, there's various ways you can talk about storytelling, whether it be what gets you engaged in a story, whether you like the characters or you like the plot or whatever it is. But when you're looking to create a podcast episode or an article that kind of uses these ideas of storytelling, I like to think of it as three things: believable characters, experiencing meaningful events, who must cope with the consequences. So very simple, three things: characters, events, and consequences. Those are the three things that you want to look for when you're looking for a story. And when it comes to an event, it's not just something that happened. I mean, it partially is something that happened, but we want to dig a little bit deeper, and we want to look for a moment of change, a moment where there's tension, where something could go wrong or something could go right. And I think one of the best examples I have of this is the story by Dave Evans. And I'll just play the clip.
So back to that hillside, we threw rocks for what seemed like ever. We just kept throwing rocks across the road. And I ran out of good chucking rocks. And so I reached back into the cliff rather than picking a rock from the ski slope. And I just pulled a rock from the cliff. And before I hucked it, I looked at it. And it's a good thing. I was holding in my hand a perfectly preserved dinosaur egg, just like the ones that Kitching had found 30 years earlier. And my jaw dropped. And without saying a word, I just turned to Hillary. And she looked at me, and she looked at what was in my hand, and her jaw just dropped. And I just retraced the arc of my arm from where I had picked up that rock in the cliff face, and we turned, and beside it was the outline of another egg, and another egg, and another egg. 6 eggs in a perfect line. We had found a dinosaur nest. So we spent the last part of the expedition chiseling and sawing that nest out of the hillside. And it turned out to be amazing. 36 eggs, all arranged in a tight clutch. It was a beautiful fossil. But more importantly, it reprogrammed our search image. We were looking for whole eggs or eggshell fragments as they would weather out of soft sediment. But what we should have been looking for is the faint outlines of eggshells that are thinner than your fingernail, cross sections of eggs in the hard red rock. And once we realized that, our luck changed and we were off to the races. We found another 13 nests in that tiny little road cut. And
now that moment is incredible. He discovers an egg just by not throwing it. It's this incredible moment of change for him, this like eye-opening aha moment. But when you're dealing with scientists or other or other people that you might be interviewing for a podcast or whatever, getting to that moment, finding that event in someone's life is a lot harder than you might think. I want to show you what we first got when we got David's story. This is a lot. He started with like all of the backstory, all of the history of whatever. And what we really want to do is start the story on day 3. Not day 1, not day 2, day 3. And so you got to kind of like dig for that moment of change, dig for those brilliant moments. And they don't always have to be super high stakes, but Ray has this moment where she was in an accident. She got hit by a car while she was crossing the street, and the police are asking her some questions. And when you find the moment, you want to think about the consequences and what those consequences are. So what could go wrong? What would happen if something different went on? And it's all to get at those stakes and that tension in the story. So let's listen to Ray's clip.
So the police comes in, and suddenly this memory that I have from the room is just, the room is so much bigger, and my bed is so much smaller and really long. And at the end of the bed, this police is standing, and next to him, my husband, and I'm just like tiny on this bed. And he's asking me questions about my accident, and I have a really vague memory of it. So I'm just like trying to tell him what happened. And he's writing things down, and it just feels like he's a doctor writing things down, waiting to tell me I'm dying. Like, that's how it felt. So he keeps writing things, and then he's done. And then he tears this piece of paper and he gives it to me, and he says, so here's your ticket because you jaywalked. And this is the court date and time, and you will be attending the court. And I'm like, excuse me? Court? A ticket? I am thinking that I'm an immigrant. At that point, I have been waiting for my green card to come for around 3 years for no good reason, something that should have taken me 6 months. So I'm thinking, oh, great. On top of all this resume that they're looking at it to see if they want to give me a green card or not, there's going to be a ticket and a court case and everything and crime and prison. And just like, I'm thinking more and more. And I'm just crying. And I say, what does that mean? Why do I have to court? Is this going to affect my immigration? Am I going to be deported? And I'm just crying. And he's like, no. This is like a petty crime. And he looks at my husband and he says, do they have petty crimes in Iraq? And my husband furiously looks at him and he says, Iran. She's from Iran. Yeah. Do they have petty crimes in Iran? And I'm confused and I keep crying and that's over.
So once you find what that event is, you want to then start looking for why it matters to them, what's important to them in that moment. So for Ray, in that moment, when she's being questioned by the police and finds out that she has this fine for jaywalking, even though she's the one that got hit by the car, she's not worried about anything except for what that means for her immigration status. And so that's what's important to her. But it doesn't always have to be something as big as getting a green card in the US or whatever. Sometimes it can be as small as an email. And what you want to just do is find what that tiny morsel, why it's important to them, or if you're telling a story about yourself, why it's important to you. That's what the consequence is. That's what we're trying to get at. And I could play this clip. It's by Alice Fleerackers, and she's talking about this. She's filling out a grant proposal, and her supervisor just says copy and paste the purpose of the research from some other study as to why it's important. And she's like, what do you mean copy and paste? Like, this is so important to me. But whatever that importance is, whether it's big or small, you want to dig into that so we understand why the audience should care about it and why you care about it and why the person that you're talking to cares about it. And depending on, I really like this quote from Steven Zimmer, the bigger the story, the smaller the art. When we talk about stakes and tension and consequences, when you have big life and death consequences, you don't got to do much to your story. It's already pretty engaging. But when you have smaller consequences, whether that might be like you're worried about this email you're sending to your boss, you got to work a little bit harder to get those across why it matters so much. Because for a lot of people, who cares about an email? But for that one person, that email is like life or death for them. So this is one quote I always kind of keep in the back of my head when I'm thinking about how to get across those consequences and how to create that tension. How much do I have to work to make the audience understand what's at stake here? And once you've figured out the event and the consequences, then you want to focus on character. And the important thing with storytelling is that you don't just want to tell us about the character, you want to show us the character. And I think Jesse does an incredible job of showing us who he is in this moment. And I know some of you in the audience might know Jesse, but Jesse is probably one of the happiest go lucky guys ever. I don't think I've ever seen him have a down day. He's always like in his pictures, he's always a thumbs up kind of dude. But we get to find out just how much of a thumbs up dude he is.
And it's at this point that Flipper looks to the group and asks, has everyone used a snorkel before? Now, I have never used a snorkel before. In fact, up until the dive shop this morning, I've never even seen a snorkel in real life. My only ocean experience is splashing in the light surf and making a sandcastle on the beach the day before. And yet, even though we're about to embark on a 45-minute swim in choppy seas with a wetsuit for the first time and fins for the first time, I say yes. Because I don't want to seem like an idiot in front of these other obviously adept tourists. And besides, it's a piece of plastic tubing. One end goes in your mouth, one end goes above the water. How will it be? And so we jump in the water, and pretty much instantly, with my snorkel not in properly, I begin to inhale a little bit of salt water. I'm also unduly alarmed at the fact that my wetsuit is filling with water, which fortunately, once it stops, I realize that's probably okay. But the fins, which are supposed to propel us so nicely through the waves, for me are an impediment. I keep kicking myself in the legs with my fins. And while everyone else paddles away like a fish, I cycle like mad just to keep at the end of the pack of tourists that are following Flipper. And so after about 50 feet of swimming, Flipper looks back to the group and says, "Is everyone all right?" Now, rather than say, "Help me, I'm slowly drowning and I've inhaled some salt water and I can't swim, please," I flash a stupid grin. I give a hearty thumbs up as my legs beat furiously under the water, and I say yes. And so Flipper goes, "Great!" And he turns around, and the grin is instantly removed from my face as a little wave hits me, and I inhale a little bit more salt water.
So Jesse, even though he's basically drowning, would rather just give a thumbs up than admit defeat. And so in this moment, he shows us how much he cares what other people think of him and how willing he is to just like smack a smile on his face and pretend everything's okay. And these are the kind of bits I look for in storytellers that really show us their character. Because you can tell someone that you might be a happy-go-lucky person who always has a smile on their face. But if you can show it, it's so much better and it makes for much better audio or just storytelling in general. When you can show rather than just tell. And you can either do this within a scene or a narrative or something like that, like Jesse's done in his story, or you can do it in kind of a summary. So if I was to show you who I am at the time of one of my stories, I might say something like, let's say I'm telling a story about when I was 13. I might say I was very worried about what other people thought of me. And I was always like very conscious of how I looked and stuff like that. Or I could be like, I would pick out my outfits every single night, carefully lay them out on my bed, and make sure every item was perfect. So there, you get to see how my brain works and how obsessed I am with the outfit I'm going to wear the next day at school. So it's this idea of show rather than tell that really makes stories come alive. And then once you got those three main bits, you want to string it all together, because a story is a beginning, middle, and end. And what we want to do is, this is a study done by Kurt Vonnegut, where he mapped out all of the stories and the kind of narrative arc they follow, and they all fall into one of these 6 categories. I mean, the first one, you got Cinderella, rags to riches. The other one, you got which one's a good one to point out? Romeo and Juliet. All starts out great and then ends in fire, basically, of death. And then you got, what's this one? Oh, Christmas Carol. You got your ups and downs. So all of the stories kind of generally fall into this category. And so you want to think about how you want to start your story and how you want to end it. And usually that event that you picked out, that aha moment, that moment of change, that lesson learned or whatever, usually comes near the end of your story. And then you want to figure out how you can show that change by tracing back and to see what makes sense. So I was working with a storyteller, and he was telling me about how one day he just decided he couldn't deal with technology anymore. He was over it. He had been in the back of a cab and his phone just kept going off, and it was like notification after notification after notification. And it just sent him into a complete and total mental breakdown, to the point where he couldn't go to the airport. He couldn't get on that plane. He asked the cab driver to turn him around, take him back to the hotel, and he locked himself in a hotel for 5 days, turned off his phone, turned off his computer. And when he finally picked himself together, he moved back in with his parents and eschewed all technology and just did yoga and meditated and stuff. And even now, he researches the dark side of technology. But for me to show that change where he had a complete and total breakdown, I needed to show, and he needed to show, that at one point he really loved technology. And so I was asking him, I was like, before this breakdown and before you've decided that you don't really want technology or social media in your life, what was your relationship with technology like? And he's like, oh, I loved it. As a kid, instead of a teddy bear, I had a robot. He had a Radio Shack robot that he slept in his bed with, like hard plastic. That's how much he loved his little robot. And he was always the guy who was first in line for the latest iPhone. And he worked for startup apps and tried to get them off the ground. So he loved technology until one day it all just snapped. And so showing that change, I had to trace back to his childhood. But there are other stories where you don't have to go back so far. If you're telling a story about a trip or something, and say the event takes place in the airport while you're trying to get a rent-a-car or something like that, do you really need to tell us about how you got on the plane, how you went through security, how you ate the pretzels, whatever that is? No, probably not. You could probably start the story of you walking up to the counter to get your rent-a-car. And so trying to find that medium of how much do you need to show before to get to this event of change is a balancing act. And so once you get all that, you got your story. And so believable character, experiencing meaningful events. But I think there's one other thing that really brings podcasts and storytelling alive, which is a unique voice. And that comes down to either you as a person being the unique voice to help usher these stories into the world, or finding people who have a unique voice to share their story, to help them share their story. And so I do both. I think developing your own unique voice is incredible. And I always go for vaguely sarcastic and just pointing out the idiocy of the world sometimes. But I do other stories where I think it's really important for other people to have a voice. And that's what the work I do with storytellers, I want to show other people's voices and just show how diverse and how everyone has a story to share. So that is all. I got about storytelling and making your science stories come to life. I think integrating them into a narrative and into a story is one extremely powerful way to get the audience to care. But yeah, questions.
Okay, we do have some questions for you, Misha. Thank you. That's really
I love it.
Our first question is coming from Yagnesh, and he asks, do you have any tips on how to approach interviews so that you can get the clips for the engaging story?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, showing true curiosity when you're talking to these people is a really great way to get them to like open up. And I often ask people to kind of the whole show versus tell. I asked people to describe like what the place looked like, what it smelled like, what did it sound like, and then I asked them what were they thinking about, what were they feeling at the time, and just to get that full rounded sensory experience. And it can really give us an idea of like, yeah, you might have just been standing in a room, but were you having a full-on panic spiral? Because I want to know about the inside of your head. And a lot of it ends up being kind of like you play therapist for an interview with this kind of stuff. I've had people cry on me. It's weird. It's awesome. But yeah, I think just trying to get into the deeper side of what they're trying to say and just kind of listening is pull out those moments from them.
Okay. Our next two questions come from Anam. Her first question is, can you give us tips on how to best show a character, and how do you bring that out when you're interviewing a guest for a podcast? And then I'll let you answer that first, and then I'll get to her second question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some people naturally do it, but also sometimes I play a game with them. I'm like, okay, how would your friends describe you, kind of thing, and getting them to think in almost, because a lot of people are really bad at self-reflection and analyzing themselves. But to get them to kind of think about maybe how their friends would describe them can be a really good way to figure out that show versus tell. Or in like Story Collider workshops, we often play the like, what's the best and worst thing someone would say about you in this moment kind of thing. And so oftentimes I like to pick moments of like childhood as like my example. And so I'm like, ooh, okay. So when I was 13, the best thing about me was that had impeccable style for a 13-year-old. Honestly, great. Worst thing, I was a giant bitch, like horrible child. And so just trying to like figure that out. And then you can kind of work from that. Or maybe there's stuff that they do all the time. So one of the producers on the Story Collider podcast, she's a giant nerd, like straight up loves animal facts and stuff. And so I'm like, when she's telling a story about how she met her husband, she talks about her dating life before, and she was good at like getting guys to approach her, but then as soon as they would come up, she would just start spewing animal facts at them because she would see like a tattoo or whatever, and so she builds this into her story. And if you ask them, okay, well, what's something like really typical for you to do, and then they might like have something like that. Or even just like in the case of Jesse, like getting him to show us that he was like, thumbs up, I'm drowning. Can help too.
Okay. So there's actually a stream of questions in the chat about asking whether or not you have any sort of resources about how to become a better storyteller, books, or any perhaps documents you might be able to share.
I do. Okay. So one of my favorite ones is by Matthew Dix, and oh, actually, it's on my shelf. I'm going to go get it. 1 second.
Okay. Fantastic.
All right, I'm back. Okay, so Matthew Dick's book, Storyworthy, fantastic. Literally for stages and kind of stuff. Also, Lightman's Long Story Short is awesome. I really like that one. And then for just general like podcasting and like storytelling, audio storytelling, podcasting stuff, Eric Newsom's Make Noise is fantastic. I assign it to all my students. I love it. And also the Outwire by Ira Glass and whoever drew it. It's a like graphic novel, which is so cool. So yeah, those are my recommendations.
Okay. So one of the second questions from Anand before the resource questions were, do you have any favorite storytellers in the podcast world?
Oh, so many. Yeah, I think Matthew Dix is a great storyteller in general. I mean, obviously he wrote the book. But yeah, I think Catherine McDonald tells amazing stories about her research. I've worked with her a couple of times, and I never thought I would like sharks, but I do because of Catherine. And who else? I really like Christine Gentry. I think she does an amazing job at breaking all of the storytelling rules and just making incredible stories. I also, one of my favorite person whose podcast I worked on to do was, oh God, why did I forget their name? Forget that. I mean, there's so many good storytellers out there. You just kind of gotta figure out what your style is. And it's all very subjective too. Like what my favorite stories are is not necessarily what someone else's favorite stories are. And there's different types of stories. So yeah.
Okay. I actually have a question for you.
Go
So
for it.
when you're listening to your interviews and then sort of maybe making your script as you make your podcast or whatever you're producing, how do you decide what the best words are to really like, the best words to use for your story? Because it's like the language really matters, like you said, right? So you want to try and really evoke the listener.
Yeah, I think so how I write for like print is very different from how I write for the podcast. And I think with the podcast, I'm mostly concerned about like, can I read this in a way that doesn't sound dumb? So I always try and like write to my own voice, which is a lot harder than it seems sometimes. But a lot of it's just like me sitting there and thinking about a sentence for like 20 minutes and then being like, nope, this is dumb. Have to rewrite all of that. Whereas like for print, I don't know, I kind of have actually found out that not everyone has an inner monologue, but I have a very, very verbose inner monologue. And so, so it's kind of like my inner monologue on paper a lot of the times. But yeah, I guess I just try and like have, I don't know, it's hard to say like what words I choose. It's more what I feel like would best represent that, or what might be funny, or what might pull up people's heartstrings, and kind of like what I want the audience to take away from that.
Okay. Sort of just follow up on this. I'm really interested about what you said about the inner monologue. So how does that sort of reflect how that gets affected into what you write? Like what you're thinking in terms of what the words you put down?
Yeah, so I think for storytelling, it's actually like super helpful that I always have a constant inner monologue, because there's like, yes, there's everything that's happening on the outside, but what's happening on the inside is often like it's your reaction to the outside, and it's often, sometimes it's like completely opposite. So when I'm doing storytelling, I think that's a lot of what I draw from is like what's going on the inside. And so the last story I did for the Story Collider podcast, the like outside world is a 15-minute walk, but most of the story takes place inside my head of me just like having a complete and total spiral about my dad deciding to quit chemotherapy. And so that can be really helpful to like get at that internal world.
Okay. We have here another question from Jesse. He's asking, do you have any tips for building rapport with guests who are a bit more reserved?
Yeah, I guess just often just being open and like showing that you're non-judgmental is really, really helpful. Sometimes I share like a little piece of me and like something weird about myself to kind of get them to open up, or just try to like relate to them. But usually with like interviews or when I'm working with a storyteller, I don't just delve in and be like, tell me your deepest, darkest secret. Like that never works out very well. I mean, for some people it does. They're like, oh, okay, all right, let's go. But it's a lot of like kind of reading their language and trying to dig a little deeper. And there's also a point where like you might just be pushing too hard and you just got to back off and be like, you know what, if you want to talk about it, great. If not, then that's cool too. So just kind of giving them that out, I think, is really helpful, and making sure that like a lot of the work I do with storytellers is just supporting them, because they're dredging up this like really raw and vulnerable part of their lives. And so a lot of it's just kind of like holding their hand through that.
Okay. We have here another question from Grace. She's wondering how long it generally takes you to put together a story, and what you can tell us more about the editing process.
Yeah, so for Story Collider, it kind of depends on the skill level of the storyteller, how long it takes. So I work with people who are professional storytellers. I also work with people who have never told a story before. And so I would say it takes between like 2 weeks and 2 months, kind of a thing. It really depends on kind of what they're like and how many back and forths we need to do. And so the editing process, I usually have like a call with them to kind of like run them through the logistics, and then I off and ugly write a draft where I just want them to get like the whole event down on paper and kind of how they want to share their story. And then we kind of go back and forth where I like pick it apart in ways where I'm like, this seems confusing, I don't understand that, or like I'm curious to know more about this. And so I pick out key moments, and usually what we end up with is a story that has about 3 scenes, and that kind of like follows a narrative arc, and you're looking for that moment of change.
Okay. I think that might be it for questions. Thank
Sweet.
you again so much for taking time out of your Sunday to come talk to us about science and storytelling.
I think there's one more question from Janine.
Oh, sorry, Janine. She asks, is there a certain question that really gets people to open up with a story? Oh, yeah.
Or how to frame the question.
Or how to frame a question to get people to open up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just the basic like open-ended questions can be really helpful. And like often when like people don't have a story idea in mind, or don't come, a lot of my storytellers come with a story idea in mind, but sometimes we gotta like help them brainstorm. And so I usually start at a place where I'm like, what's a story that you like find yourself always telling at a party or to your friends, or like what's your like go-to story? And often that kind of go-to story will lead to more questions, and just being open about it. So like, oh, what happened there? Or how did that go down? And those kind of like open-ended questions that offer more dialogue than like a yes or no can be helpful.
Okay. And also there was one from Grace that she followed up immediately with. She asked, she wonders if there's any tips that you have about finding guests and their stories.
Social media is delightful. People share so much of themselves on social media. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm always looking for people who have stories. So like even people I just like meet randomly, less so now because I don't see anyone ever. But before it would just be like, oh, a friend of a friend kind of thing. They're like, oh, I know this opera singer who lost her voice. And I'm like, wait, what? That's terrible, but like, great story. I want to meet her kind of thing.
Tell me more.
Yeah, I'm like, I need to know. And so it's more just like being curious and being open, and kind of realizing that everyone has a story to share, and just trying to find that story.
Okay. I think that's it this time. So for realsies, thank you for coming on Sunday and giving us this talk.
Of course.
Yeah. Anyone else? I'll have to check. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.